You're listening to The Purple Mystic, a podcast for the modern witch, with your host, Natalie Sedgwick. Welcome back to The Purple Mystic, a podcast for the modern witch. Today I am talking with Christopher Penzcak. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I am excited to have you. I wanted to just kind of delve into a little bit about some of your background and your work and what the craft means for you, because there's like a plethora of paths that people can follow. And I know there's a lot of debate about whether initiation is necessary or you can be solitary, or if it's good to be solitary, then find a group you gel with. And so I kind of would like to talk a little bit about some of your background, how you came specifically to the path of witchcraft, because I think you studied under a lot of people. You studied under shamanic pathways and other things as well, correct?
That's correct.
So let's talk a little bit about that. How did your journey begin, so to speak?
With strong skepticism. That's my entry point into all of this, is that I thought it was a little bit crazy. I had a friend who was involved in all of this, and she was an older friend, an older mentor in my life. And when she revealed to me that she was a witch, I just thought she had lost her mind, because that just was so out there. And I mean, I'm not that old, but this was early 90s, so it was before all the movies, it was before all the TV shows where people were talking about being witches. She really came from the era where it was super private. Like, she didn't tell anybody. It was a big deal that she told me. It was like a coming out process in a lot of ways. And, the world was so different then. And I just didn't understand it, and so she luckily, was a wise woman, and she's just like, here, if we're going to talk about this, if you think I'm crazy, like, let's have some vocabulary, read this book. And then she gave me a couple books to read. And the last one out of the first three that she gave me was Laurie Cabot's Power of the Witch. And Laurie Cabot was her teacher. And then she's like, oh, we've got the vocabulary now to talk about what it is. And I was so fascinated by the end of that conversation. I wanted to know more. So she took me down to Salem to one of the big Samhains on Gallows Hill, for the big celebrations. And I was fascinated by it. It was a little weird, but it was fascinating. And then she invited me to a coven gathering, and I got a chance to do a spell. And I sort of had the open mind, but I was still the skeptic at that. Like, maybe this works for some people, but, is this real? Is this not real? Coming from a background of Catholic school and not trusting religion, And so she, I had the chance to do the spell, and the spell came true, beyond my wildest dreams. And I said, hey, I want to study this. I want to know more. And she taught me meditation, and she taught me tarot, and she taught me some basics of witchcraft. And then she brought me to Laurie Cabot. I started doing formal studies in the Cabot tradition, and learning in the Salem community and meeting different mentors down there. And that began my adventure. But my entry point was skepticism. I really was a prove it to me kind of guy,
That's very funny, actually.
I often joke, I'm like,
how many books do you have out now?
Yeah, almost 30 at this point. Almost 30.
I kind of lost track there. So let's talk about some of your books. What was the first book that you wrote, and what brought you to writing that book? Was it your desire to share your experience with other people, or was it you saw there was a need in the community where more information was needed in a specific topic?
The very first book I wrote never got published. A lot of people don't know that.
Really?
I wrote a book on astrological magic, because that's sort of what I got fascinated with in my coven. And there wasn't really a lot of good books. There's a little bit more written about it today, but even then there wasn't a lot written about it. And I wrote sort of what I like to think of as my graduate thesis. It was really intensely researched, but it wasn't very good. And I got a really kind letter from, at the time, was the owner of Weiser Books, back when it was Old Weiser in York Beach, Maine. And I found out later from folks who worked at Weiser is that when she rejected you, she wrote under synonyms of different anonymous, names. And the name she gave you kind of told you where she thought. So I was the name that was like, had merit, but we weren't going to sign it. And there was other people that were like, crazy people that they would give different names to. So if they called up saying, I want to talk to this person, which I was like, that is brilliant. And I need to work that into
so now I'm going to be curious when I submit my web name. I'm going to get back with my rejection letter.
It was very old Weiser, when it was only like 10 people. So it's a different world now. But Yeah, so that I found that really interesting, but the letter was so kind, and I got rejected from, pretty much every place I submitted to, because it was just so like a magnum opus, and I was, what, 27 at the time, like I didn't really know what I was doing. So I'm glad they rejected it, but they were very kind about, if you have something else that's shorter and more focused, please, send it our way. And at that time, I was working in the Boston area. I worked for a music studio and record company called Fort Apache Records, which was pretty big in
Mhm.
the indie scene and back in the day. I got to
I
meet a lot of
remember it.
interesting rock stars.
I remember it. Yeah.
And I couldn't practice in my coven as much because I worked a lot at night, because we had to go to shows and we had to meet bands and everything like that. So I started changing my practice to doing things in the park. And what could I do in the morning? What could I do, like walk in the city streets? Like in that time, you had to kill between dinner time and going to the club. And that became my first book, City Magic. It was really just my journals kind of put into a book form. And Weiser was very interested in that. So Weiser ended up being the first book to come out with them, with City Magic.
Good. Now you're also published with Llewellyn Books, aren't you?
I am, yeah. I had a strange story of I would hesitate to call it a bidding war, but my first two books were sent to Weiser and were sent to Llewellyn back in the day when they didn't care whether you did multiple submissions to them. And there was some weirdness at Llewellyn. They had a different staff at that time, obviously, because it's changed so much. And they sort of kept me hanging. And so when Weiser offered me something really clear, I ended up going with them, and there we are. And then the person I was dealing with at Llewellyn got fired. And the head of Llewellyn, Carl Weschke, God's rest his soul, messaged me and he's like, "What can we do to get these books?" And I was like, "They're under contract. There's nothing you can do." And he's like, "No, how can we get one of them?" And I'm like, "Nope, you can't." He says, "Well, next time you have a book," he goes, "send it to me personally." And I ended up sending, and strangely, in my weirdness of my writing career, Weiser rejected The Inner Temple of Witchcraft, my arguably best-selling, most popular, most
Wow. Really?
well-received book. Yep.
Oh,
And
wow.
I pitched it to Llewellyn, and they not only said, "This looks like it's a series. What's your plan?" So I sent them the whole proposal for, at the time, it was a 5-book series. It turned into 6. And I said, "I'd really love to do CDs and meditations with it." And they're like, "Yep, we're on board." And they were, green light for all of that. And they took really good care of me after that. So
Yeah, I think the first book of yours that I read was the protection one that came with the CD.
yep,
Yeah, that
which is
one was
cool.
very valuable. It's still in my. I'm actually in my home, but I have my office where all of my books are. Because the husband is like, "You're taking those to your office, right?" Yeah, so that there's that. But I do like having those books there because that's also my sacred space. It's where I do all of my work and all of that. And sorry, this thing is just going off. I don't know if you can hear it. That annoying little but that was a really good book, and I appreciated the CD with it because it was good to hear the meditations and things. I think that's something that a lot of people that are new to the path or new to meditation itself have difficulty with. That whole concept of you've got to clear your mind.
Right.
And I always tell them, no, you don't. But it does help to have something to focus on,
Yep.
to keep your thoughts on track.
Right. And if I didn't have teachers that guided me through it, I don't think I would have picked it up that easily through a book. Back in the day, they'd be like, "Oh, you can record yourself doing the meditation." I'm like, nobody does that.
Yeah, I actually
You did that. Excellent. You're one of the
I have
few.
done that on occasion. I'm an OBOT. I'm an ovate
Okay.
grade. I just reached the end of the ovate grade, and yeah, some of those ritual meditations, especially dealing with the ancestor work, I did go ahead and record it for myself, but I would have preferred Philip Cardom's voice
Right.
in my own because I just find him far more pleasant to listen to.
There's a
But
little weird magical thing that happens though when you listen to yourself guiding yourself.
yes, it is kind of
Yeah.
an unusual experience.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I think, more personal.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And especially when dealing with ancestor work.
Right.
Definitely, for sure. So I know that you started the Temple of Witchcraft, correct?
Yeah, I am one of the co-founders with my 2 partners, Steve and Adam. The 3 of us are sort of the ones that had the vision for the structure of it all together. And we've had a lot of amazing people helping us out with it, but it kind of was born out of the system and the books that we have.
Very good. So talk a little bit about your particular school of the craft for those that are interested, because I know just before we got on, we talked briefly about, there's a lot of raging debate within the community at this point in time with initiation is really important, or can you be fine practicing solitary? And I'm kind of on the fence. I think you can practice fine as a solitary practitioner if that's if you really put your heart and soul into it, but you lose something of the community working. I definitely think when you have a community behind you, it makes your workings that much more powerful. And that sense of community and coming together as a coven or as a group to do a ritual definitely lends that sense of unity that amps your power. So, in terms of your school, how is your school structured compared to some of the other schools? And uh, do you like? I know Lori Cabot's very big on the science of magic, which is one of the things that I liked about her perspective. Because, for people such as yourself who are skeptic when you come into it, and oh, is this real? Does this work? What's the foundation for this? My husband being one of those people, he's slowly, but he's getting more curious now as he sees things work themselves
Right.
out. So tell us a little bit about the philosophy behind your school and how it's structured and how you do things.
Well, I think, all the things you mentioned are the challenges that I think all of us as modern practitioners and modern community has right now, and it sort of organically grew out of the work that we're doing. So the Temple of Witchcraft really started from a series of classes I was doing. And it was just a group of people who wanted to know what I knew. And at that time, Lori Cabot wasn't teaching, because before that, I was just like, you should go take a class with Lori Cabot. I didn't want to teach. And I ended up doing these classes that were just based on the techniques and the experiences of things, and did the first 2 degrees are pretty much what I learned from Lori Cabot with my own spin and my own view on things. And I really take the definition she has of witchcraft, not just as a science, but she also has that emphasis that witchcraft's a science, an art, and a religion. And that's kind of her 3 degrees. And that's sort of been a foundation for me of understanding how do I approach witchcraft. But rather than think of it as degrees, I think of it as them woven together. So at different points, I'm focusing on the art, different points, I'm focusing on the science, different points, I'm focusing on a religion or a mystery tradition. And as those classes kind of blossomed, to me, they were just about you use your techniques for you. It wasn't necessarily about, any specific tradition. And then I had a large group of people who'd graduated who wanted to do Sabbats together, and there'd be different working groups, and I would lead some public stuff, and they would come to that, and I had a coven on top of that. And people would want to either join the coven or come visit for the coven and things like that. And people were looking for identity, and I think I discounted that, because I wasn't necessarily looking for identity, which was enough for me. And I had somebody who jokingly referred to themselves, but was sort of serious in the group that they were in, that they were a Penzakian in the Cabot lineage. And someone else who's in the group, because I wasn't around for that, said, Christopher would be really upset with you if you said that, because he's never said that, he's never presented
So
what he's doing as that.
were you upset about that when you heard it?
I was, because that was not what I was doing or teaching. I felt I got the reason why they did it, but I think that probably should have been a conversation before they decided that that's what they were going to say and how they were going to describe themselves. So I realized we needed some type of identity, and what sort of evolved into it was just calling the system of techniques the temple tradition, the Temple of Witchcraft tradition. And then that group kind of grew, and we decided, a lot of my work is about service and healing work and community work. So can we create something that holds that? And so the people who've been with me the longest, we sat down and talked about some ideas that Steve and Adam and I came up with about structure, and decided to create a nonprofit. And the big kind of center hub of the nonprofit is the school. And so what you get in the school that's different from the books are really all the technique and all the history and all the research and the pattern. And what I teach my private students has a lot more of the culture. So there's things that are specific to how I see mythology and the context that I connect to, and ways of encouraging people to find their own context. Not that that's not in the book already, but it's a culture has grown out of it that's a little bit separate from the book. So anybody can look at the books and do their own thing with it. But if you're in the community, you'll start kind of connecting to that community group soul, And so I was traveling, teaching it for a while. And as I traveled, I realized you can't really pack this into a weekend. You can't even really pack this into a week. So I started doing apprenticeships with people, and then the online stuff started blooming, and we started doing online classes. And now in the age of COVID, the online classes have been incredibly important to keeping the
Exactly.
community together,
Mhm.
But I am a big believer in in-person stuff. And I am a big believer in initiation. And so when you're running an online school, it's a weird place to be. And
Yeah,
this is how I think of it, is I think initiatory experiences are important,
extremely,
but I think
extremely.
some people have initiation rituals and nothing really happens.
Mhm.
And I think some people have initiatory experiences and never have a formal initiation. And they're as far ahead, if not further, than people who've had the traditional rituals.
Thank you.
So and I'm also a big believer in what some people would call self-initiation, but I would call more and emphasize the idea of solitary initiation, the idea that you might be the only person there, but the spirits are initiatory. And if you
Yes.
follow a pattern, and if you make those connections and you make those contacts, even if it's online, but you've gone through a process, you've been
Right.
properly prepared, I think the spirits can kind of come in and catalyze a process that you can't necessarily do on your own without the pattern. So
I
that's sort of my meeting ground.
definitely agree. And that I found to be a true fact with working with the OBOD, because they're based out of England.
Right.
But in your Guerci, you have the ritual, and it's the same ritual that all of us follow. And there's something to be said for that, because like you said, there are people who go through initiation, but it never really clicks within them. And
Right.
then there are those who have an initiatory experience. I That is perfectly how I would try to. I've been struggling with a way to describe it, because my husband has asked me about it. And I told him, it's hard for me to explain how I can feel connected to a group of people I have never met in person, but through the inner temple working, the inner grove, we call it the inner grove, but the inner grove work that we do in that astral plane, you do connect with those people and with the guides, and you feel them, and it's a very real experience. But I'm also one of those technical people that likes to have that actual physical experience with things, and it's been very difficult in the age of COVID. So I did find a seed group up in Oklahoma that invited us up to do. They were going to do the initiation ritual for anyone that wanted to participate, that felt like they would like to participate. So I thought that was very neat too, that even here there's that opportunity for that physical, because it is hard to balance the online with the physical, which was what I was going to ask you about next. In the online classes, how do you structure that, being that you are a mystery school and there is a level of initiation? Do your online students engage in like a forum, kind of like what we're doing here, where it's a Zoom forum and everybody's there in the Zoom room, but you're doing it together? Or is it something where they are required to come out to where
It,
you are?
it depends on the class. We don't require anyone to travel to come out, but we give them opportunities to if they want to. So for the mystery school for us is divided into 5 levels. The first 4 are the mystery school, and the 5th is like high priestess, high priest ministry work. And every year until COVID, we had a yearly festival. And so the first day of the festival was anybody who was an initiate could come and be physically consecrated. So it was a physical recognition of their initiation. It was sort of a shorter version of the initiation ceremony, but anyone who was an initiate could come. So your friends could support you. It was a group process. And we'd spend the night. It was an all-night affair. We'd start with level 4 and then go down to level 3, level 2, and then at midnight it was level 1. And the whole kind of community who wanted to be there could be a part of it. For the 5th degree, I always do an in-person initiation for anyone who wants to come, but we have members that are like in China. We have members that are in South America, so no one's required to come, and it's the same level of membership. It's the same responsibilities. It's the same role, because we do feel like that pattern does connect you astrally to the temple. Depending on the class, and we've struggled with some of the things in post-COVID, because before COVID, nobody really knew what an online class was. So you
Mhm.
could sort of say, this is how we're doing it. And everybody was like, oh, okay, that's what we're doing. And now people have expectations that it's a Zoom class, or it's going to be, on a Discord. It's going to be something like that. And so now we're kind of struggling in our next online class. Will be a live Zoom. No one's going to be required to go. Previous to that, we'd actually recorded live classes. So what I would do is I'd have an in-person class that we would record that was concurrent with the online class. And that way people sort of get a window into what it would be like in person. But now we're not having online classes at the moment, or in-person classes at the moment, excuse me. So I'm going to do something that's specifically geared to the online group and specifically geared to be on Zoom, and see how that goes for the next round of classes. And just, really try to make it a little bit more participatory. There's always an online forum, so we do a Google Classroom where people can ask questions, and we post things daily, and we post the lessons, and everybody gets on top of the recording. They get kind of an internet book of shadows of, what's a PDF of our book of shadows. It's the culture and the specific rituals that are to our community. But yeah, so we're kind of in a flux of trying to be able to serve it a little bit better to the community. So we'll see what happens this year. But
Yeah, it's definitely brought about some changes. I think what helped me with some of this stuff was that, I was a student at the university and they had a lot of online courses. So I
Right.
was already kind of used to, they did it through Blackboard, which is like its own platform, but I was used to how those kinds of things worked. And so it's been kind of helpful, just popping into Zoom, even in my speech therapy practice, because my day job is I'm a speech language pathologist. I have a private practice here. And so switching into a teletherapy format was very easy for us. I
Yeah.
set it up, said, let's do it. The caregiver has to sit with the patient, but we're good. And I think it kind of serves that. It brought a lot of that out. And I think people started to realize that there's value in even that kind of interaction, because at least
Right.
I get to talk to you. I get to see you. This is
Right.
like a real conversation, right? And it definitely does make a difference, I think.
Yeah. We had been doing it since about 2008, more like a correspondence course. But now I think the expectations and the technology is so much better. Like in 2008, it was the first levels of Skype, and
Yeah,
it was a lot harder. Yeah.
for sure. Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned a while back, because this hits on something that's very key for me, and I'm in the process of doing some writing for the order on this particular topic. And you said that your focus a lot is on healing, which without giving out anything I'm not supposed to discuss, a key focus of the ovate grade within the OBOD is on healing work, not just for yourself, but working as a healer for others. So
Right.
do you guys work with that on a physical level, on a metaphysical level, both? Like, do you go out and do ministry to like prisons and things like that? Or
We do all of those things. So
really?
prior to the temple being a nonprofit religious organization, which opens some doors and gives you other rules you have to deal with, my day job, to so to speak, was a tarot reader, energy healer, and teacher at night. And I feel like I fulfilled for myself and my community that proverbial role of like the witch in the hut, and the cunning woman or cunning man at the edge of the village, because people would come to me. The vast majority of them were not pagan. And either they had crazy expectations, which sometimes you had to deal with, or they were
Mhm.
sort of at the end and medicine wasn't helping them, and either you were helping them make peace with death, or you were helping them, and sometimes strange miracles occur because it's magic. um,
Exactly.
and so I'd usually do a reading for somebody, and then that would come out with what was going on in their life, and then they might ask for some help, and some of it would be from spell crafting to more kind of metaphysical shamanic style healings and rituals. As the temple opened up, we have a whole ministry. Our whole structure is based on the 12 zodiac signs. So for us, the healing ministry is Virgo. Virgo deals with service and healing, and the apothecary that we make. We grow a lot of medicinal and magical herbs here at the temple. And so we're not technically practicing medicine, so
Right.
everything for us is really about the spiritual virtues of it. But we can talk about how historically this herb has been used for stomach problems, or this herb has been used for
Right.
blood pressure, things like that, and help people out. That I do have an herbalism background, so I do try to help people with those things. But my own personal practice tends to focus on flower essences and really helping people with the mental, emotional, spiritual
So
side of their
are
illnesses.
you box certified?
What's that?
Are you box certified?
I'm not box certified. I actually make my own. So I'm all
Oh,
about doing
excellent.
things in the land. Yeah. And trying to
Yeah,
do with the herbs that work here. I took classes through a place called Delta Gardens, which is local
okay.
here. And
I
they're
know, I've heard of them.
they're through the
I'm
Flower Essence
currently
Society line.
I'm currently going through the Chestnut School of Herbal Medicine.
Oh,
And
cool.
so they have called it, because I'm a member of the American Herbalist Guild. And so, yes, I'm in the process of growing my own, medicinal herbs. Also, I run an apothecary, but in Texas, you can't call it apothecary. Yeah, they're, the
Curios.
pharmacists have a rule on that, right? So it's apothecary and publishing,
Right.
because I offer tarot and Reiki and other services. So it's not strictly an herbalism practice. So I can fly under the radar with that. But it's the same thing. I have found that actually my herbalism background has helped with my speech practice, because I've had clients who suffer from things like acid reflux, which of course erodes the esophagus. And they're
Yeah.
taking these proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole, and it's not really working for them, or they've been on them for a long time and they don't want to be taking them anymore because it eats up your magnesium and everything else in your
Yeah.
body. And so having that background, I think, has actually helped my practice, because I can say, well, if you wanted to look into doing something like drinking some marshmallow root tea, it doesn't affect any of your other medications, but it's definitely mucilaginous and helps to, reduce that. And they've come back later and said, man, that was the best thing ever. And
That's
my
awesome.
doctor can't believe the difference. So, it's that focus. So talk a little bit about some of your outside ministry, because I'm really curious about like ministry to those in prisons. And I think partially because I had a cousin that served some time. And so I see kind of what he struggles with. So do you guys help just within the prison system, or do you help them transition out of that?
We haven't had the opportunity to help somebody transition out because our prison ministry is relatively small. So in our astrology, it falls under the Capricorn ministry, which deals with restrictions and time. And so I ended up doing prison ministry in the New Hampshire prison systems for about 8 years. And then I retired, and someone took over for that work for it. And I found it really satisfying but intense. It's a level until you've done it, you don't really understand what you're getting into. And I would say I was taking over for somebody else, and I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. I'm glad I did it, but I'm glad to have a break from it, and perhaps I'll go back at some point. And the way that different systems work, like I cannot necessarily work with somebody who I ministered to in a prison on a one-to-one basis. They can come to different events. So if they came to a Sabbath that I happened to be the celebrant for, they could come to, but they couldn't come to me for private classes or private healing or things. And that's just the restrictions that our state has. And I know a lot of states have those types of restrictions. The tough part we had with some of the prison ministry work is that not all of them that we served really identified as witch or Wiccan. Most of them tend to associate with Asatru and a lot of the northern traditions, although I had a very diverse group when I first started. So sometimes they found their support in other places, or they found their path in other places. And I was happy to be a part of that and to help them out with that. I will say the one experience that I had was really interesting. I was getting gas at one point, and a gentleman came up to me and he was like, "Hey, how you doing, Christopher?" And all of this, and I just couldn't place him. And come to find out, he was somebody I helped with, and he was like trying not to make a big deal about it in public, but he wanted to recognize that he saw me. And then it took, like, I was driving off, and I was like, "Oh, I know where I know him
Oh
from now."
yeah, I know who that is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
it's
it was
kind of the
lovely to
same
see him
thing
out.
with
And,
the speech pathology, because under HIPAA, I'm not allowed to acknowledge people at the store unless they acknowledge me first.
right.
And sometimes they don't understand that. So, unless they're going, waving at me, and hey, how's it, so they'll get upset that I don't say something to them. So that's something I always tell everybody right at the out front, hey, because of your privacy, I'm not allowed to say, hey, how's it going? You have to approach me. And I think, that's an odd experience in and of itself. But there have been a few people that have come up to me out of the blue, and I'll be like, I know this person, but I can't think of where I know this person.
I had an interesting experience where someone who had come back out into society, and then they signed up for the online class. And so I had to then write a letter to the old prison, to the chaplain, to say, oh, so and so. And they didn't say it in the application. I happen to recognize the name, but I didn't want to have my status be in jeopardy. So I just kind
Right.
of laid it on the table and said, if I need to remove myself from this, or if I need to tell them they have to study with a different teacher, and the fact that it was an online class, the fact that I was not emailing them directly, it was part of a larger group and they'd have a mentor and everything, they were fine with that going forward. But
Oh,
it's
that's
interesting, all the different restrictions you have, and the disclosures you have to make and what you can and cannot say. And yeah,
yes.
it's been very rewarding, and I had a really amazing time. I'd say probably my most profound experience with prison ministry. They allowed us, after maybe 3 years of me going in, to do outdoor rituals. Up until that point, we're doing everything in the chaplain's, kind of main classroom area. And as we're getting there, and it was like a chained off little grassy area that had not been mowed. And the chaplain was incredibly supportive. He's the one who actually invited us to come out there and wanted to have these men be supported. And even though he was coming from a Baptist background, he was loving, supportive man. And someone said, "Can we take off our shoes?" And he looks at me and he goes, "Only if it's a religious requirement." "It's a religious requirement, isn't it, Christopher?" And I was like, and in
And
my
you're like,
mind, I was like,
yes.
"No, it's not really." And then I was like, "Oh yeah, it's
You're
a
like,
religious requirement. Let's all take
yes,
off our
yes,
shoes."
it is.
Yeah. And he's like, he goes, "Good, good." He's like, "So I'll just note that it's a religious requirement for an earth religion that, whenever possible, you take off your shoes." I was like, "Yep, that's a great way to put it."
That's an excellent way to put it, because it
And
definitely grounds you.
and the whole ritual I had went into the fire because they were just fascinated. One man told me he had not been barefoot on the ground for 12 years.
Oh, see, I couldn't even imagine not being barefoot on the
And I was
ground.
like, wow, my mind is blown. Okay, the whole ritual is going to be about us being on the barefoot on the ground. Like, I had a whole elaborate mystical thing planned, but this is what we're doing.
I was just saying, that's a whole reconnection, though. I mean, the spirituality of earthing, I guess is what they call it, but just
Right.
being physically connected to the ground in that way. Because I know we have 2 oak trees in our front yard, and they are prolific fruit bearers. So there's acorns all over the yard, and I will still go out there and walk around barefoot, even though I'm going, ah, ah, ah. My husband's like, "Why don't you put some shoes on?" I'm like, "You don't understand." But it is definitely an experience. You feel that energy, and
Yeah.
it just comes right on up through you. So yeah, I definitely, yeah, Christopher, that's a requirement.
Yes.
I bet I could just see him leaning into you too, going, "That's a religious requirement, right?"
Right, yes.
Sorry. Well, I wanted to ask you about one of your books,
Sure.
The Feast of the Morrigan.
Mhm.
Guess who I work with?
Devotee of the
So,
Dark Lady. Yes.
um, although sometimes it serves its purpose. I just have this lovely statue of her that I just, whenever Harold's being a bit of I just go, just kidding. But what brought you to write that specific book? Is she a deity that you have worked with? Is it?
No, absolutely. She is probably my primary deity. Well, theology is such a weird thing in witchcraft, and here we're dealing with, technically, legally, my job as in a religious organization, and having to reframe the idea of, well, what is religion and what is theology and everything. So I am, I guess, what people would call today a soft polytheist. I'm an occultist at heart. So I believe everything is interwoven and interconnected and interdependent. So I think of, the goddess with the capital G. But if there's a face to the goddess with the capital G that has been most intimate to me, it's been the Morgan, or specifically Maka, one of the aspects of the Morgan. And she was the first goddess to really make herself visibly known to me. So in the Cabot tradition, where I first trained, they would have different totems for the different directions. And in that training, air was south and was the crow. And Laurie would talk about Maka and would talk about the Morgan and talk about different Celtic deities, particularly the Irish. And calling the quarters, I remember where it was my turn to call the south in one of the larger rituals, and I just felt like the breeze, and it was very distinct for me, and I'm the skeptic, so I'm like, was that real? And I'd
Feel that?
sort of see a shimmer, and then I started doing my own solitary rituals, and one of the ways we learned was calling deities in the 4 directions along with the animals. So I'd call Maka and the crow from the south, and I would feel that presence, and it was like she started getting closer to me, and she became one of my primary guides and kind of primary tutors in a lot of magic and witchcraft. And I really feel she is responsible for me doing this work full time. One of the things that started happening was she'd start appearing in just my meditations, and she did for quite a while, helping me and showing me things and taking me on journeys. But then it shifted. And she started up getting closer and closer to me. And as she got closer to me, she'd say, "You need to teach more." And I'm like, "Well, I'm running a moon group, but that's all I really want to do," because I was a musician at the time. So I thought, I was going to be a famous rock star. And she'd disappear. And then the next time I'd sit down to meditate, she'd be just a little bit closer and be like, "You need to teach more." And then she'd disappear. And then finally we're like nose to nose. And she's like, "You need to teach more." And I finally said yes. All those times up to that point, I did not say yes. And I said, "Okay, yes, if that's what you want." And she disappeared. And I lost my job like 3 days later.
Oh, man.
You
Yeah,
know?
she is an interesting aspect of the goddess to work with because she has a tendency to kick you in your
Yeah.
and she doesn't take this feeling sorry for yourself very well when things are down. She will come and put her foot up your backside and say, "You need to get up, you need to find a way, you need to make it happen." And she most frequently comes to me in my dreams, which can be unnerving because I wake up in a cold sweat sometimes. But it's interesting to note that as I've worked with her over the years, we used to never have any kind of crows around here. We didn't even really have grackles, which are very common here in Texas. But we now have 4 crows that live in the greenway directly behind our house, and you hear them every morning. And my husband's like, "You brought them here?" And I'm like, "She is here. That is her.
Right.
That's her. I don't know what to tell you." But one of the funny stories I like to tell was I work with a day hab that's around the corner from my house. And when I first was kind of coming to openly work in the path of witchcraft, and I was like, "Well, I really drawn to the Morgan, but I don't really know. And, is that really who I'm supposed to work with?" And, a lot of people are like, "Oh, you shouldn't work with her." And I came out from the day hab and my car was covered in blackbirds.
Oh,
Nobody
wow.
else's car, just mine. They were on it, over it, underneath it. And one of the day hab workers that walked out with me goes, "Boy, they really like you, don't they?" And I went,
What a
"Yes."
sign. That's amazing.
There's your sign. But then my sister pointed out to me later, "Well, they've always been around you. Don't you remember when you were little and we were playing in grandmother's backyard and that big black bird brought you that shiny button?" And I was like, "I didn't remember that." My mom's like, "Oh, yeah, because Corianne got upset that she didn't get a gift from the bird." And I was like, "Oh." So she's always been there.
That's
Always
awesome.
been there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she can be tricky she doesn't take you got to be prepared. It's a trial by fire for sure with her.
I agree with that totally. When I went to her after losing the job and said, "What am I doing next?" All she said was, "Well, now you can teach more."
Yeah. I just
And
gave you the
so,
opportunity to
yeah,
teach, didn't I?
yeah. Which, I mean,
It's
out of all the things to lose at that time, my job was probably the best thing to lose at that time. So I appreciate what she chose. But
yeah.
yeah, and we sort of made a deal where I'm a Taurus astrologically, so I like to know, where my money's coming from and where my house is and where my food is and all those good grounding stuff. And she said, "As long as you do this wholeheartedly, you'll not have to worry about any of that." And
And
although
you
I've had
haven't.
mean months, it's all worked out in the end, and I've not really had to worry about anything. So she's kept her promise, and I've kept mine.
I definitely think that she definitely keeps her promises as long as you keep your end of the bargain.
Yep.
But if you let her down, she's going to let you know
Yep. Yeah.
right away. Yeah, but that's funny you bring that up because I just heard a similar story on the OBOD podcast. They were doing a talk that Philip did last year in Pennsylvania, and he said this lady came to him and said, "Oh, Philip, I made a mistake." And he goes, "What?" And she goes, "I cast a spell." And she goes, "I cast a spell for more time." And he goes, "Well, that doesn't sound so bad. You don't have more time to get things." She goes, "No, I lost my job."
That
So it's
happened.
those unintended consequences of your magic. So let's talk a little bit about that. Is that something you ever bring up in any of your books? I'm trying to remember.
Absolutely. It's another one that, through the grace of Lori Cabot, teaching good foundations. So she would always put the caveat in all our petition spells and all our intentions, that I ask this be correct and for the good of all involved, or I ask that this be acceptable to me on all levels, but some type of caveat of making sure that if I'm not seeing the blind spot here, kind of putting that short circuit into it if it's going to harm me in some way. And sometimes it doesn't harm you. It's not necessarily what you wanted, but it does unfold. And I actually teach, because I do a lot of the ceremonial magic as well. I have that weird love-hate with this idea of high magic and low magic. And in the end, I think there's no distinction of it, but I get the textbook distinction that high magic is about magic of your soul and enlightenment, and low magic is anything that works and does something. And I really kind of came to this conclusion that the way that we teach it, and giving Lori credit for that, it really kind of links the two. Because if you're saying, let this be for my highest good, let this be for the greater will, even if you're asking for a job or a romance or $50 or whatever it is that seems, quote, unspiritual, you're asking that it be in alignment with your true soul. And if it is in alignment with your true soul, what is higher magic than that?
Right.
So it bridges the gap between those two things. But I think a lot of people learn to do magic even more so today of like, I just want what I want.
Right.
And I don't teach it that way. I teach it has to be in harmony.
And it should be. We're all intertwined. And I think that, that's something that people kind of lose when they're not given the guidance of a community, when you are solitary. I mean, there's talks like Sky Alexander in her book, she talks about, you need to have the morals and the ethics and all of that. But when you have someone who's physically guiding you, it brings it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Very, make sure that you do this and this is why, you get that personal experience of, well, this is what happened with me. So yeah, I heard that story and I chuckled and I was like, yeah, that would be me. That would be what would happen to me. I lost my job. Yes. Yep.
But you got time.
She got plenty of time now, right? Yeah. So then you're trying to backtrack and okay, now I need work. What am I going to do? So in terms of your full-time job and what you do now, you work primarily within the Temple of Witchcraft. Full-time. That's your full-time thing.
My full-time is witchcraft. I would not say it's always the temple, because the temple is a nonprofit and mostly volunteer organization, so none of us make a salary. But the way things tend to work is if you bring in money, you get paid. So like if you're teaching a class, you get a percentage of the class. So I get a percentage of our school because I'm running that. But our celebrants get a percentage of the rituals and things that they bring in. I'd say my job is a combination between that, writing, and still seeing private clients. So my job since the early 90s has been, teaching and seeing clients and doing writing books and writing articles. And that's pretty much, where most of my focus is. So I try to take some days to write and some days to teach and some days to take time out to talk to people and do, little things online. And now it's the world of social media. That's almost like a separate job to support it all.
Yes, isn't it though? Let's talk a little bit about the world of writing because I'm also a writer. I love to write. I have written since I was old enough to pick up a book and a pen. So let's talk a little bit about writing because one of the questions I get a lot when people ask me about my writing is, what do you do when you have a writer's block? Like, how often do you experience that? My style of writing is I never write an outline. If I write an outline, it's never going to go well. It's like the outline is in my head. And then once I start to write, it flows. If it flows, I know the writing is good. If I keep getting stuck and it's not writing, I'll set it aside and come back to it because I know it's not good. And then I'll go back and reread. And then at that point, it may start to flow. But if it's not flowing out of me, it's not good. And I know it. So I just shelve it for a time. How do you get past some of those blocks? And how do you find the time to sit down and write when everything else, like the whole world's on fire right now?
It's true.
Especially with what's going on now in Russia too. I just don't even listen to the news anymore.
Right. Yeah, my writing process has changed a lot over the years. So how I'm operating now is different than maybe when I began. But I came back from a music background, like I said. And so I had a composition teacher who gave me probably the best advice about music, and I try to apply it to writing. He said to put notes on paper every day. So I try to write something every day. But for me, writing is a combination of organizing class notes and then the actual writing of the books. And the vast majority, but not all now, because I've got some crazy artistic ones that have come out recently. But I would say the vast majority of my books are essentially textbooks for classes that I've done. So I have workshopped the material, I've researched it before I've ever sat down to write it. I've had my own direct experiences with it, then I've shared it with small groups of people I trust to give me feedback, and then I've shared it with the general public. So I have all these stories I can draw upon, and usually people have asked me questions, so I know like what I need to explain better, what kind of questions and concerns would come up. But I try to do a little bit of writing. If it's not class notes, then actual writing books almost every day, and I try to do that first thing. So I wake up, do my meditations, have my breakfast and all that. And then the first hour to 3 hours of my office day, if I don't have something else going on that requires my attention, is to do the creative side of things. And then after lunch, I try to do all the business administration, social media type of stuff and going through that. But at this point, I've got multiple projects going on at the same time, which was unusual because when I first started writing, I would kind of have the idea, start it, almost be on fire for it, and finish. And now I have things like I've got probably 3 books that are in various stages of done, but I'm sitting on them. I think one of the problems I have with a lot of modern books today is that book trade is almost like magazine trade. So people are trying to get stuff out. Publishers are trying to get stuff out to fill their catalog really quickly. And I really want to be sure of whatever I'm putting out there is as clear as it can be, as worked as well as it can be. So I'll do a first draft. And I was talking to a fellow writer who fell out of his chair when I told him this. And I said, I might sit on a first draft for 9 months because I got something else going on. I got other classes going on. I got another book that's coming out. And then after that 9 months, I'll have clarity to be like, is this what I want to say? Do I want to change something? Do I want to rearrange it? Do I have some distance from it that I can see it? And sometimes I really do. And sometimes I don't. But yeah, so my process is a little bit different. So I have a book right now that's 13 chapters. I've done 9 chapters of it. And then I got busy with something else, and I'm like, oh, it's at a natural break point, so I'm going to let that go fallow for a little bit, then I'll come back to it and do the last part of it. Right now I'm doing a whole series of classes. I'm trying to fit 9 years of classes into 3 years because I'm doing them concurrently, and I got to do the last set of class notes before March. So that's been my focus for writing, and that's been super fun. It takes the teachings of the 3 rays of witchcraft, which was my first non-Llewellyn book. I started my own publishing company called Copper Cauldron, also with my partner, Stephen Adam. And so these are the advanced classes that will be sort of part 2 of that. But a lot of our work has been through Copper Cauldron, and some of the advanced stuff has been put into the new editions of the Temple of Witchcraft series that the Llewellyns are releasing. So I've got lots of things, lots of weird editing and anniversary editions and things going on. So always writing something, but a little bit of a different process now.
Yeah, I always write a little something every day, even if it's just something in my journal, just something to clarify. And I make notes for myself, but outlines, if you ask me to write an outline, like even in school when we have reports, you had to do your outline, your first draft. I would write my first draft, then make my outline based on what I'd written in my first draft, turn that in. So while everybody's scrambling to get their first draft done, I'm like, finished, and I would just turn it in and then make whatever corrections. Because it just, to me, outlines are not useful. Notes are useful. References are useful because you have to make notes of your references or you'll forget where did I get that idea from? And then you're scrambling to go back and go, what was that I was looking at? But when it comes to like actually sitting down and going, okay, I'm going to write a book. This is going to be chapter 1. This is going to be chapter 2. I might have some rough ideas, but
my latest book, which hasn't come out yet, but the latest thing I finished, the full draft of, was a series of classes that a student transcribed. And then I took the transcriptions and massaged it into a book format so it would make more sense and work the tenses and everything like that. And that was so enjoyable. I didn't think I was going to enjoy it, but I had a series of classes I was calling my Heretical Sabbath series. So it was looking at Christian mysticism overlaid with witchcraft for the Wheel of the Year. And I recorded them because they were fundraiser classes. Then I had a student who offered to transcribe them. And I was like, oh, well, I can take bits and parts of that if I want to write about it. And it was so clear and it was so interesting to kind of have that organic process and to see people's questions transcribed and to work those answers into the text. And I had so much fun with it. So, I don't know if I'll do anything else like that again, but it's an interesting, different process for me.
Really a neat way of doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. So
do
you have a working title yet, or are you going to hold off on that?
It's called, the working title is called Sabbatic Visions. And hopefully it'll be out, if not by the end of this year, the beginning of next year.
So we'll be looking for that. Will you have it available for pre-order, and will it be through Copper Cauldron or?
It will be through Copper Cauldron. So here's a weird, like, I'm such a bad capitalist about things. Like, I'm such a bad, I'm a good business person for doing direct business one-on-one with people, but I'm not really super great in I mean, like, we never take pre-orders for Copper Cauldron because I feel weird taking money for something you don't have yet.
Right.
So we'll
No, I
announce when it's
understand.
out,
I'm the same way.
and I'll advertise it ahead of time so people can get anxious about it and know that it's coming out and be looking forward to it. But I hate having, because most of the pre-order stuff has to go through Amazon, and I don't like, there's things about Amazon that are lovely during the pandemic, but I don't really, I
Mhm.
rather people go to their local shops. So I don't want to give Amazon the chance to get all the pre-orders and not have people do their local shops, but most shops don't want to do pre-orders. So, I just wait till it
Right. So when this book comes out, like, do you still do the whole book tour thing where you go out with your book and kind
yeah,
of meet the public, meet your public?
it's tougher. It's tougher these days. I mean, obviously because of COVID, but even
Right.
before that, like, social media has sort of made, that, I won't say superfluous, but it's not what it once was. And I
Mhm.
mean, I've been doing book tours since 2003. And I have traveled most of the country, and I've done lots. I love to teach. And I've loved the book tours. They were fun and they were interesting, but at the same time, like, there's only so much that I can do of here's this book, you should check it out. Like, if I'm going to go someplace, I want to do an intensive weekend that people want to do the work, and oh, I happen to have a book on it. Sure, that's great, but I
Right.
want to do the workshop. So I've been enjoying more like flying out for a weekend and teaching in a place and then flying back rather than being on the road for 30 days. That's tough on me these days. I'm getting older. Not really, when I was
Oh, come
younger in
on
this,
now.
when I was
Surely you
younger with
have a
this,
spell for that, right?
it was interesting to do. Like, I would say my first book tour, my first big book tour, started in Seattle and ended in San Diego. And I was on the road for like 22 or 24 days. And I will tell you, that was sort of my initiation into adulthood. Like, I felt like I was an adult person who had a business trip and had a rental car and was doing my hotels and managing my own day. I'm like, it's so silly, but it was really how I felt like I came into my adulthood as an author.
Yeah.
And I did that maybe 6 or 7 times, and I don't really feel the need to do that ever again.
Well, and I think that, I think that the landscape of writing and being an author has changed because of Amazon and agencies like that, where, it's so easy just to Google a topic, find a book, buy it, you like it, great. You look for more from that author, but there's not the whole, oh, we have this author coming to town, a big promotion, here's
Right.
the book, sign it, and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think it's changed a whole lot since
And
then. So
even when you think about like things like this podcast or doing YouTube or Instagram videos or things like that, like, on my first tours, I was interviewed on camera a lot for local TV,
mm,
or local radio stations. So like, you were only in a geographic market, like nobody
right,
could go online and hear you. So it was an
exactly.
interesting take. Like, I remember going into a radio station in Boston for one of my first interviews for City Magic, and it barely got the wattage of half of Boston because it was a small independent station, but they were who wanted to talk to a witch, so I did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. You did it. The podcasting is kind of fun. I like to talk. Obviously, I'm a woman and I'm a speech pathologist, so talking comes naturally. And I like connecting with other witches that may or may not follow the same path or have the same definitions. I think it's enlightening to have these discussions and to talk about things that are going on in the community or how we handle things or our definitions, because part of me is always seeking what is that underlying thing that connects us all as witches,
Hmm.
if you want to take on that title. So what is your underlying definition of magic? For me, in terms of defining religion, I see witchcraft as a religion because to me a religion is that set of ideals and morals that govern your day-to-day actions, right? So for some people their politics might be their religion because that's what guides their day-to-day decision making in life is these are their principles. So that's what guides you, and for me that's what your religion is. It's who you are at your core. So for me witchcraft is definitely a religion. Being in the obod for me is a religion. It's my path to how I view the world, the lens through which I view the world, and how I guide my day-to-day decision making and treating other people and working with other people and providing the services that I provide and in doing what I do. And
Mm.
so for me, magic is can be defined as that manipulation of the outlying energies around us for a purpose, whether that be for ourselves or for somebody else on whole. So how would you define magic?
That was beautiful. That's a great question. Hard to follow that. For me, I think it changes as time goes on, but I do go back to that definition of the science, the art, and the religion, and really trying to educate people on religion. I love your definition of it because so many people have that prophetic textbook biblical definition of religion. And I'm like, well, there's mystery religions. So for me, witchcraft is really about the mystery. I think it goes back to that phrase, initiatory experience. I think a mystery tradition provides the framework and the context for your initiatory experience. And the initiatory experience is what utterly transforms you. And I think that's what we have in common as witches. But I think that's also what we have as difference as witches, because each of us has a totally different experience that utterly transforms us. But that's the magic of it. I often describe being a witch like, and this has worked for me, and this has got me some flack. But I often describe being a witch like being an orientation. You are or you aren't. You may go through a process of coming out to yourself and coming out to other people. You may know other people who are, being a queer man. I often think of it as a similar process of, I might not know anybody. Somebody could be gay and not know anybody else that's gay. It doesn't mean that you're not. You just might not have the cultural context of it, but it's still your way of approaching the world. So you said something about your lens to the world. I think that's a really great phrase for me too. That's the idea of my approach to the world, my orientation to the world is the magical worldview. And to me, that's what witchcraft is, and separating it from other magical traditions, because I think witches emphasize that interconnection and interdependence, but it's also the paradox of the will and the individuality. And the witch doesn't want to be told what to do, which is super hard when you run a school, because I'm like, here you are, here are your assignments, and this is what you've agreed to. And I know if I was and the teachers I've had, I've always kind of buckled against, well, why do we have to do it this way? And I think that's a natural framework for a witch, but it's also finding that balance point between that paradox. It's individual, but it's collective. It's tradition and guided, and it's independence.
Right.
You know?
Well, like Star Ann Ravenhawk told me, we're all solitary practitioners because you're not with your coven 100% of the time,
Right.
but you're always doing your magic. So, to say that you have to be part of that, but you're right. It's all about the balance. It's finding that place where you can work with others, but you're comfortable doing this on your own as well and feeling yourself a complete individual, but also a cohesive part of the whole microcosm that is a macrocosm of the world. So it's interesting, and that's one of the things that drew me to the craft itself is the fact that there is that interconnection and yet the ability to stand alone. And like you
Mm.
said, kind of going against, I think witches have always kind of buckled against some of those rules.
Right.
The questioning. It's not bad to question. Sometimes
Absolutely.
it's bad to buck against the system because the system's there for a reason. But sometimes, it's never bad to question what the reason is.
And I think that bucking against the system is also part of the process. I think, we talk a lot about levels of maturity in growth cycles and developmental cycles and age and grief and all these, but I think there's magical growth cycles too. And I don't think we talk enough about that. There's, kind of coming into spiritual adulthood. There's sort of kind of spiritual teens. I think when it's held really well, like I was talking to a traditional coven leader in a structure that, I don't necessarily work in. And she said, when it's held really well, you get a chance to work out all your childhood stuff, and you get a chance to work out all your sibling stuff, and how you get kind of a do-over in many ways when it's held well. When you're in a group that doesn't hold it well, then that's the downside of community, and it's a little pathological, or it
Like
gets
the
a little bit
drama and
drama.
what is that? What do you call it when somebody's like the egoism, the ego, just the ego of some of these people.
But part of the process too, I had a Hindu teacher of mine actually say, we talk a lot about transcending the ego and the cutting off of the head and Kalima and all that. She goes, but you have to have an ego to transcend it. And a lot of people come to this with no sense of self. So like, you have no sense of self, and you sort of swing into like having a huge sense of self. And then you find that middle functional ground at some point. But I think that's part of a developmental cycle too, that we don't see. that we just
Definitely.
don't understand, you know?
Exactly. When it's and I think where you reach that level of maturity is when it's not just all about yourself. You understand the value of the community
Right.
and bringing that experience to your own practice. One of the things that occurs in the ovate grade is you're posed the question: if this was the last course you received, would you feel confident moving forward? If we told you we weren't going to send you any materials for the druid grade, how would you feel about that? Do you feel you have enough to move forward? And it was at first my eyeballs probably went like this when I read it, because I went back and reread it and I went, because I'm one of those, academic type people that needs things to read.
Yep.
And after I sat with that question for a little bit, I was like, yeah, I would be fine, because I would just cycle back to what I did as a bard and come back through that process, because they started. One of the things I like about the OBOD versus some of the other traditions, this was something I wanted to ask you about too, is that I have noticed that in a lot of Wiccan based schools, there's an emphasis on getting into the practice of magic. Oh, you got to learn how to write a spell and do a spell. And a lot of people that are new are kind of like, oh. But with the OBOD, the emphasis is on the basis and understanding of inspiration and connection before you move into that magical practice, which, although I'd already been in a magic